The experience of the current Covid-19 pandemic has forced people across the world to reevaluate every aspect of their lives. Suddenly, without much warning, everything changed. In these weeks of lockdown, we've been challenged in all kinds of ways, and even those as those in authority seek to find a way out of the restrictions brought on by the pandemic, it's perfectly clear that things will never, for the foreseeable future at least, return to normal. As Christians, we're being challenged to reflect on how our faith might help us address what's increasingly being referred to as the new normal that is coming about. How might we worship together under the new strictures that will necessarily be in place when the lockdown is lifted? How will we be able to share the message of the good news in a time of restricted travel and social contact? What has our faith to say to people about where God might be in all of this? Alongside such questions, and underlying our responses to this massive natural disaster, is one about God in the midst of creation, and the call on humankind to use that gift wisely and well, certainly rather better than we've done up to now. At such a moment, it's perhaps opportune to revisit Pope Francis's Encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, issued 5 years ago in 2015. As someone who's been engaged in the study of theology in a Catholic context for over 40 years now, I find it amazing how the tables have turned. For much of that time, the merest whisper of dissent from something a pope said or wrote threatened the wrath of prominent voices in high office and in influential positions across the Church. The accusations of disloyalty, the cardinal sin for theologians in the eyes of these people, were frequent, as time and time again the voices of many leading intellectuals in the Church were drowned out, ignored, or pounced upon. How times have changed. Pope Francis, more or less since his election, has been at the centre of severe criticism for his words and actions by some of the very same people who made those accusations of disloyalty under the previous two popes. Since we're dealing here solely with the understanding of creation and ecology, we need only look at the hue and cry against the Pope's words coming from sources accusing him of Marxism or communism, or else of meddling in affairs like business and economics that are out with the remit of a pastor. From this perspective, the Church should only be concerned with spiritual matters: prayer, the sacraments, sin, and forgiveness, but only in the narrowest understanding of individual morality, usually involving sex. To be fair, such criticism is also being made from outside the Church by people who consider that such matters as climate change and business ethics are not the business of believers. Because of these criticisms coming from all sides, Pope Francis opens his encyclical letter by situating his reflections in the tradition of his predecessors of the modern era. He cites firstly the encyclical of Pope John XXIII, Pacem in Terris, which was written just a few months before he died in 1963. He goes on to show how each of the popes since then also wrote about concerns for what was happening in the world. He also recounts at length, in a quite remarkable ecumenical gesture, the thoughts of the Patriarch of Constantinople of the Eastern Orthodox Communion of Churches on these same matters. Finally, citing the example of the man whose name he took when he became Pope, Francis of Assisi, he evokes his great hymn of creation from which the title Laudato Si comes. Towards the end of this introduction to the letter, he reaches out to all when he writes, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we're undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvement, and talents. Notice that this encyclical is a call for further dialogue between all interested parties. He's not claiming to make any definitive statement on the issue, though he will set out some reflections from a uniquely Christian perspective. Having set out in his introduction to Laudato Si his Catholic credentials, the Pope now moves on in the first chapter, what is happening to our common home, to reach out to find common ground for all people, believers and unbelievers alike. And once again, he's standing firmly in a long-standing tradition in Christian thought. We're currently marking the 6th week of Easter and the celebration of Ascension Day coming up. On the day before the Feast of the Ascension, the first reading at Mass, coming from the Acts of the Apostles, gives us the account of St. Paul's address to the men of the Areopagus in Athens in chapter 17 of the Acts. This was the place where the free men of Athens gathered to debate and to pass intellectual and at times legal judgments on various matters brought to their attention. It was a place of debate. Paul's message to these people is the same as he preaches elsewhere: the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the call to faith. However, the way in which he presents his case is markedly different from his previous arguments in the synagogue at Thessalonica, reported only a few verses earlier. Here we find that for 3 Sabbaths he spoke to them, expounding the Scriptures, interpreting and explaining that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead. And the Messiah, he goes on to say, is Jesus. By contrast, at Athens, there's no mention whatsoever of the Scriptures, the Old Testament. His audience didn't know the Jewish Scriptures and quite probably held the Jewish faith in contempt. Here he has to argue from reason to find common ground. Although not hugely successful, he did manage to convince some people of his message. The point is that in order to be understood, the message has to be adapted to the language and imagery of each audience. This has been recognized down through the ages and was articulated by the Fathers at the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes, where they write, "The Church learned early in its history to express the Christian message in the concepts and language of different peoples, and tried to clarify it in the light of the wisdom of their philosophers. It was an attempt to adapt the gospel to the understanding of all men and women, and the requirements of the learned, insofar as this could be done. Indeed, this kind of adaptation and preaching of the revealed word must ever be the law of all evangelization." This call to adaptation of the message is clear, but it's not a simple and straightforward pathway. In the 1970s, the great Protestant theologian Jürgen Moltmann, in his book The Crucified God, wrote about 2 opposite poles in the presentation of the Christian message: identity and relevance. The message could be presented in such a way that, although identifiably Christian in its content, the language and imagery used might be so far removed from those of the audience that nothing would actually be communicated. I always remember, as an undergraduate in Durham, my tutor, Charles Cranfield, saying, the only way to be certain about one's orthodoxy in preaching the gospel on a Sunday would be to stand at the lectern and to read from the Greek text of the New Testament. What's the point? Nobody will understand what you were saying. Well, very few. The message has to be translated and interpreted. At the other extreme, the message might be expressed in ways that an audience could easily latch on to, but might be devoid of any meaningful Christian content. Relevant, but with no particular identity. Straying too far towards identity is the natural tendency of a more conservative mind, while straying towards relevance would be that of a liberal one. The task of preachers and theologians is to navigate a route between these two opposing poles and offer material that's both. This is the task that the Pope has set himself, and in this first chapter he attempts to make common ground with all peoples, not just Christians. Pope Francis cites the common factors that rear their heads in any discussion of creation and ecology in our time: pollution, waste and the throwaway culture, climate change, access to clean water for all, the loss of biodiversity, breakdown in society, global inequality, and the poor response of humankind to these issues. He acknowledges differences of opinion on these matters, ranging from outright denial that anything needs to be done, to the idea that actually we need to reduce the human population drastically and let nature take over. In the midst of such a minefield, he invites dialogue. He writes, "On many concrete questions, the Church has no reason to offer a definitive opinion. She knows that honest debate must be encouraged among experts, while respecting divergent views. But we need only to take a look at the facts, a frank look at the facts, to see that our common home is falling into serious disrepair." Having established, or tried to establish, common ground with people of all faiths and none, he's now ready to explore the specific ideas of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We come now to look at the second chapter of the Encyclical, entitled The Gospel of Creation. And as the chapter opens, the Pope acknowledges that the question of whether the Church should be involved in discussion on topics like ecology is disputed. But of course, he insists that the Church does have a voice on these matters. He writes, "If we're truly concerned to develop an ecology capable of remedying the damage we've done, no branch of the sciences and no branch of wisdom can be left out, and that includes religion and the language that's peculiar to it. The Catholic Church is open to dialogue with philosophical thought. This has enabled her to produce various syntheses between faith and reason. The development of the Church's social teaching represents such a synthesis with regard to social issues. This teaching is called to be enriched by taking up new challenges." Once again, he places what he's saying firmly in the tradition of Church teaching on social issues and its unique methodology. And so now he's ready to set out the Christian roots of their concerns about creation in Scripture. The first thing to note about what Pope Francis writes about in this section is that he refers to the Scriptures in a much more sophisticated manner than we were used to in the Catholic Church up to 50 years ago or so. After the Reformation, when the Catholic Church emphasized sacraments and doctrine, rather than the more strictly scriptural approach of the Protestant churches, the study of Scripture was pushed to one side in favor of a strictly dogmatic approach to teaching. As a result, when the study of Scripture as historical and literary texts grew in Protestant and Anglican churches from the end or towards the end of the 19th century, the Catholic Church was left behind in this and only began to recover from the middle of the 20th century. This began with the Encyclical of Pope Pius XII, Divino Afflante Spiritu, about Scripture, written in 1944. This gave the green light to Catholic scholars to use the resources of the historical critical method in their work. This bore fruit ultimately at Vatican II in the Constitution on Divine Revelation, Dei Verbum, since when church documents have been much more solidly scriptural as a basis. That has matured over the years, to be honest. In the early years after Vatican II, church documents tended to be peppered with scriptural references without much awareness of what scholars were saying about them. And if we think for a moment about the popes of the modern era, beginning with John the 23rd, it's only with the election of Pope Francis that we have someone trained in theology after those historical critical methods and their findings became part of seminary formation. From Pope John up to and including Pope John Paul II, through no fault of their own, they were trained and ordained before the effects of Pius XII's 1944 Encyclical were to be found in the system of priestly formation. That also holds true for Benedict XVI. However, in his academic life in the German university system in the 1960s and 70s, he did come to know and to use the modern works of Catholic exegetes, and his use of scripture was also much more mature than that of his predecessors. Nonetheless, Pope Francis is the first pope whose training and background have been imbued with this modern approach, as we can see in this encyclical. Now, most of the Pope's reflections on creation are based on the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. Referring to the first account of creation in Genesis chapter 1, the Pope notes the essential goodness of creation. Now, each human person is created out of love in God's image and likeness, and how the dignity of each person derives from this fact. He goes on to note that these early texts are not historical accounts per se. This is what he writes. The creation accounts in the book of Genesis contain in their symbolic and narrative language, profound teachings about human existence and its historical reality. They suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbour, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and inwardly. This rupture is sin. He acknowledges that this observation was made by people such as Francis of Assisi and Bonaventure in the past, but it's also something which modern biblical scholarship has helped us to identify. For centuries, the Church seemed to be obsessed only with the fall in chapter 3 of Genesis, thanks mainly to St. Augustine, the man and the woman eating the forbidden fruit, through which it was taught that original sin entered the world. It's clear, however, that the following stories in Genesis about Cain and Abel, about Noah, about the Tower of Babel, are also stories of fall, which add further dimensions to this rupture between human beings, God, and the rest of creation. Pope Francis is well aware of this. He notes how the call to have dominion over the earth, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and the call to till the earth and keep it, Genesis 2:15, were distorted, especially so in the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Referring to other books of the Jewish law and to the Psalms praising the Creator, he points out that we're called to be responsible stewards of creation, not absolute owners. He writes, "Clearly the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcern for other creatures." In fact, we find in the Scriptures a demand for a more responsible approach to creation. Within that responsibility, there's also a call to share the fruits of the earth with, as the book of Leviticus puts it, widows, orphans, and foreigners in your midst. Going through the developing history of the Jewish people, as seen in the pages of the Bible, Pope Francis notes both the call of many of the Psalms to praise the Creator and of the prophets to act justly in our dealings with each other and with creation itself. Before moving on to further developments on the theme of creation in Christian thought, Pope Francis summarizes the contribution of Scripture in this way. He writes, Judeo-Christian thought demythologized nature, while continuing to admire its grandeur and immensity. It no longer saw nature as divine. In doing so, it emphasizes all the more our human responsibility for nature. This rediscovery of nature can never be at the cost of the freedom and responsibility of human beings, who, as part of the world, have the duty to cultivate their abilities in order to protect and develop its potential. Contributions to Christian thinking of theologians, ancient and modern, and of bishops' conferences across the world and recent popes all build up to a long quotation from Pope Francis, from Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures, which is the inspiration for the Pope's thinking. Further contributions for our understanding of the shared responsibility of creation follow a short, final section in this chapter looking at the Christian scriptures, and especially at Jesus in the Gospels. Up to this point, almost all the references have been to the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. Now, Pope Francis emphasizes Jesus' references to the Father and the Father's care of all creatures, his use in many of the parables to examples from nature, as well as his own enjoyment of the fruits of creation. He writes, His appearance was not that of an ascetic apart from the world, nor of an enemy to the pleasant things of life. He was far removed from philosophies which despised the body, matter, and the things of the world. Such unhealthy dualisms, nonetheless, left a mark on certain Christian thinkers in the course of history and disfigured the gospel. Jesus worked with his hands, in daily contact with the matter created by God, to which he gave form by his craftsmanship as a carpenter. Finally, in this chapter, the Pope refers to the Logos theme that St. John uses in the prologue to his Gospel. The Logos was instrumental from the beginning of creation, and St. Paul in his meditation on the cosmos in his writings. In the writings of John and Paul, creation and the life, death, and resurrection to new life of Jesus Christ are all intertwined. And so it is that the Pope can conclude from this survey, from the beginning of the world, but particularly through the Incarnation, the mystery of Christ is at work in a hidden manner in the natural world as a whole, without thereby impinging on its authority. In that single sentence, Christian thinking is brought alongside that of other approaches to questions of how we humans address the challenges put before us by the state of the world around us. At this point, we're roughly 1/3 of the way through the full text of the Encyclical of Pope Francis, and he's laid the foundations for his reflections on ecology and how the problems we all face may be addressed. Once he has laid them, there are very few, in fact only 3 in total, references to the scriptures in the rest of the text, until towards the end when once again he addresses the specific contributions Christians can make to the challenges facing all humankind. What the Pope exemplifies in this encyclical is Catholic social teaching at its best and most engaging with as many people from as many different backgrounds of faith and none, to try to promote an effective dialogue with a view to finding solutions to these challenges. In 2016, the year after Laudato Si was published, Pope Francis published his apostolic letter on marriage and family life, Amoris Laetitia. At the time, I was asked to give a talk to the clergy, first of my own diocese of Hexham and Newcastle, and later for the Middlesbrough diocese, introducing the background to the encyclical. On the day for the Middlesbrough clergy, the master of ceremonies, as it were, for the day was Deacon Vincent Purcell, a deacon of my own diocese, but working at that time as the adult education advisor for Middlesbrough. In the exchanges that followed my talk, he came up with an image that struck me as very helpful and which has stayed with me ever since. Although said specifically in connection with Amoris Laetitia, the image holds true of Laudato Si, and indeed of all church documents. He said that what we're given in church documents like this is not a sat-nav, telling us at every twist and turn of our journey precisely where and when to turn. At the next roundabout, take the third exit. In 300 metres, take the next turn right, and so on. What we have, he said, is much more akin to an old-fashioned map and compass, with which we navigate our way forward by regular sightings of features on the horizon, and using these tools to determine the best way ahead. The scriptures and the teaching of the Church as expressed in encyclicals like Laudato Si provide us with the map and the compass. With each new step forward, a new vista of the horizon is offered. Our task is to note the features on the horizon and to use our map and compass to determine our current path. Today, on that horizon looms the Covid-19 pandemic. Our faith is challenged by what we witness in reaction to what's happening. We are seeing extraordinary acts of love, evidence of God's work all around us, people working in the front line and so on. There are huge opportunities for new approaches to our care of creation as outlined by the Pope. But there are also obstacles in the way. Myopic, selfish, and incompetent leadership in many countries. Opportunists looking to make literally a killing on the back of what's happening. Calls for overruling previous steps on limiting carbon emissions and so on. A commitment to the common good of all, the promotion of justice for all humankind, and of a new relationship with creation, all based on open and honest dialogue, and all set out by the Pope in this encyclical, will offer a way forward and an offer of hope for all in these dark times. Thank you.